He was standing on gravel. He had no business standing on, holding a wallet that belonged to a man who could kill him, his heart working so hard he could feel it in his back teeth. The morning light was cold and flat. The motorcycles in the yard were lined up with a precision that looked almost military chrome, catching the early sun and throwing it back sharp as a slap. Somewhere behind that cinder block wall, men were moving. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming. A low-pressure change in the air that made his skin prickle under his coat. Eugene Calloway was 72 years old. He had buried his wife 14 months ago. He was 9 days from losing the only home he had ever owned. And he was standing at the door of the Iron Covenant Motorcycle Club with their president's wallet in his coat pocket about to knock. Everyone he trusted had told him not to come here. He knocked anyway. But to understand why an old man in a worn coat would walk himself to the most feared address in Harlan County, you have to go back 4 days. You have to go back to the morning the frost was still hard on Route 9, and Eugene Calloway was walking to the mailbox on knees that had logged one too many miles under a truck frame, and the world was exactly as gray and cold and indifferent as it had been every morning since Margaret was gone. Maggie. That was what he had called her for 43 years. Margaret on the license, Margaret on the headstone, Maggie everywhere else that mattered. She had been a nurse for 31 years at Harlan County Medical, the kind of nurse that young doctors learned to listen to because she knew things they did not yet know. She was small and precise and did not suffer foolishnesses in any of its many forms. She had loved Gene Calloway with a ferocity that occasionally startled him even after 4 decades, and she had been dead for 14 months and 3 weeks, and he was still not used to the silence she had left behind. The illness had taken her fast once it started. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. And those 6 months had cost what they cost, the way illness does in this country, quietly and then all at once. The savings went first, then the money they had set aside for the roof, then the truck fund and the emergency account, and finally the buffer between them and the mortgage that had once felt completely manageable. Gene had watched it drain with the specific helplessness of a man who had spent his whole life being competent with machines and found himself with no tool for this particular problem. After she was gone, the bills kept coming. They did not take bereavement leave. They arrived in the box at the end of the driveway, the same as always white envelopes with red printing that seemed to Gene to be getting redder, and the numbers inside kept climbing, while the one in his checking account kept falling. And then Derek Holden arrived. Holden was a developer, which in Harlan County in those years meant a specific thing. It meant a man in a good coat who drove a clean car and had a firm handshake and a smile that arrived a half second before it reached his eyes. He had been working his way through the old properties on the county's east side for the better part of 3 years, and the properties he wanted shared certain characteristics. They were old. They were held by people who were old, and the people holding them were more often than not tired and alone and struggling. He had come to Gene's door 6 weeks after Maggie's funeral. He had brought a pie. He had expressed sympathy in a practiced way that it felt almost sincere, and he had left behind a business card and a number that seemed reasonable until Gene showed it to his neighbor, Pearl Monroe, who lived 2 fields over and had watched Holden buy out the Dorsey property 2 years back. That number is half what the land is worth, Pearl had said, standing at Gene's kitchen counter, turning the card over in her fingers. He knows it, and he hopes you don't. Pearl Monroe was 74 and had survived a husband of flood and 1 bout of cancer that she referred to as the nuisance, and she did not much care for men who mistook other people's grief for opportunity. She had become, since Maggie's death, the closest thing Gene had to a daily check on the state of the world. She left casseroles on his porch. She brought him mail when his knee was bad. She called him every Sunday evening at 7, and if he did not answer by 7:15, she drove over. Gene had put Holden's card in a drawer and tried not to think about it, but Holden came back. He always came back, Pearl said. That was how he worked. First the friendly visit, then the reasonable offer, then the quiet mention of what happened to people who let properties go into foreclosure, then the not-so-quiet mention, then the lawyers. He had a playbook, and he ran it on everyone, and he kept running it because the people he ran it on were alone and could not find the energy to fight, and eventually they gave up. The mortgage payments Gene had missed were 3 now. The letter from the bank that had arrived 10 days ago used the word foreclosure twice and the phrase legal proceedings once, and was written in a font that seemed designed to make a person feel small. Gene had read it at his kitchen table at the table where he and Maggie had eaten breakfast for 41 years, where she had spread patient charts on Sunday evenings, where they had argued twice and made up 3 times and raised 2 sons who were now in other states with their own lives. And he had set the letter down and looked at the empty chair across from him and felt the specific weight of being 72 and alone and running out of road. 9 days. That was what the letter gave him. 9 days before the legal machinery started in earnest, and once it started, a man without money for a lawyer did not tend to stop it. The truck had been dead for 2 months, a throne bearing that had taken the clutch housing with it when it went. The part was not expensive in the way of things, but it was more than Gene had, and every day he did not have it, he walked Route 9 on his aching knees to the mailbox and back, and sometimes to town if he needed something, and sometimes to Pearl's if the quiet in the house got too loud. He was walking Route 9 on the 4th morning of October when he found the wallet. It was half buried in the gravel at the shoulder, brown leather, dark with road damp, and he almost walked past it. His knees made the argument against bending down. But some older instinct, the reflex of a man who had spent 40 years not walking past a problem, made him stop. He reached down with the specific care of a man who has learned the cost of a wrong movement and came back up with the wallet in his hand. He opened it at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. The cash was the first thing he saw. A thick fold of bills, mostly 20s and 50s, held together with a rubber band. He did not count it. He set it on the table and looked at it and knew without counting that it was more money than he had seen in one place in 2 years. It was, he understood, with a cold clarity, almost exactly what he needed. Not approximately, almost exactly. Then he found the license. The photograph on it showed a man in his mid-50s, dark-bearded, broad-faced, with the kind of eyes that suggested a very limited patience for nonsense. The name read Wade Briggs. The address was outside the county line, a road Gene knew by reputation more than travel. And tucked behind the license in the card slot was a patch of fabric, a small embroidered rectangle, the death's head and crossed pistons of the Iron Covenant MC. Gene set the wallet down. He sat with his coffee and looked at it. He knew about the Iron Covenant the way everyone in 3 counties knew about them. They were the men the town discussed in lowered voices. The ones you didn't make eye contact with at the gas station, whose clubhouse out on the county road you drove past without slowing down, whose name appeared occasionally in the county paper in contexts that were never reassuring. They were the men respectable people crossed the street to avoid. Wade Briggs, Bishop. Even the name had traveled, the one people used when they talked about the Iron Covenant's president. The largest man in any room he entered, the one you did not want to be wrong with. Gene looked at the cash. He looked at the license. He looked at the patch sewn into the wallet's lining. And then he noticed the other thing. Folded tight in the slot behind the cash, pressed flat like it had been there a long time, was a piece of paper. He did not take it out. He saw only the edge of it, a corner worn soft with handling the faint ghost of handwriting. He pressed the slot closed without reading it. Whatever that paper was, it was not his to read. He set the wallet on the kitchen table where the letter from the bank was still sitting. He went to bed without touching either of them. The second morning, Gene got up and made coffee and sat with the wallet the way you sit with a hard problem, at an angle not looking directly at it. He turned his wedding ring on his finger. He did that more now than he used to, a habit he had developed in the months after Maggie's death and could not seem to break. The ring was gold and worn thin on the inside of the band where it had spent 43 years against his skin. He was turning it when Derek Holden knocked on his door. Gene heard the car first, a clean engine, expensive, coming up the gravel drive at 10 in the morning. He recognized the knock before he answered it, 2 firm raps, the practiced confidence of a man who did not expect the door to stay closed. Holden was wearing a gray coat that cost more than Gene's truck repair. He had the pie this time replaced with a folder, and the smile was in place, and he expressed again how sorry he was for Gene's loss and how much he admired what Gene had built here. And wasn't it a shame about the economic pressures the county was facing? And he had been talking with his associates, and they had revised the number, revised it up. He wanted Gene to see that they were being more than fair. Gene looked at the folder Holden held out. He thought about the wallet on the kitchen table. He thought about the bank letter beside it. "I'll think about it," Gene said. And he said it the way a man says a thing to end a conversation, not to start one. Holden's smile tightened just slightly, the way it did when the playbook moved to the next page. "Gene, I want to be straight with you because I think you deserve straight talk. The bank's timeline on this property is not in your favor. My offer has a deadline too. After the 15th, we pull back to the original number. I'll think about it, Gene said again. After Holden left, Gene stood at the window and watched the clean car back down his drive. He looked at the wallet on the table. He looked at the bank letter. He looked at the empty chair across from him. That night, he dreamed of Maggie. Not the way she had been at the end, small and pale and speaking slowly through the medication. The way she had been the last clear night when she had taken his hand in both of hers, and the room was quiet, and she had looked at him with those careful, precise eyes, and she had said, Eugene. She only called him Eugene when she was being serious. It is going to get very hard after I go, harder than you know right now, and I need you to promise me something. He had promised. She had told him what she needed from the promise. He had given her what she asked. And then, 9 weeks later, she was gone, and the promise had been sitting in him ever since like a stone in a pocket, heavy and constant, and occasionally sharp when he shifted wrong. The third morning, a neighbor Gene barely knew stopped at the mailbox with a produce delivery for his wife and saw Gene sitting on the porch and came over and they talked for a while. Gene let it come out that the wallet situation was weighing on him without saying what the wallet was or whose it was. The neighbor said what neighbors say. If you found it on the road, it's finders keepers. Nobody'd know. He was not a bad man. He was a practical one. Gene thanked him and went back inside. That afternoon, Pearl Monroe came by with soup and stayed for 3 hours. She had learned about the bank letter from the specific quality of Gene's silences on their Sunday call, the silences that got loud in a particular way when he was carrying something heavy. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table with the wallet on it, and she looked at the wallet and looked at Gene and asked him directly what it was. He told her. Pearl went very still in the way she went still when she was processing something serious. Then she asked whose wallet it was, and Gene told her that too, and Pearl Monroe, who had survived a husband and a flood and a nuisance, and who was not generally given to displays of alarm, set down her soup spoon. Eugene Calloway, she said, you cannot take that wallet to those men. I know it, he said. Wade Briggs, do you know what they say about Wade Briggs? I know what they say. They say he put a man in the hospital for looking at one of his bikes wrong. I've heard that. And you're thinking about going anyway. Gene turned his wedding ring. I found his wallet, he said. His money's in it. His photograph's in it. Whatever else is in it, I didn't look. It isn't mine to keep. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. Maggie, she said, not a question. She made me promise her something before she went, Gene said. I'm going to keep it. Pearl pressed her lips together. She picked her spoon back up. I'll drive you, she said. I wasn't going to ask you. I know you weren't. I'll drive you anyway. But it was Pearl who found the next morning that her old Civic would not start the battery dead from sitting too many cold nights, and it was Gene who stood on her porch with the wallet in his coat pocket and said he would call someone else. He called his neighbor from 2 houses down, the one with the produce, and he did not tell the neighbor where they were going until they were already on Route 9 heading out past the county line. The neighbor went quiet when Gene gave the final turn. He went very quiet when the mailbox at the end of the lane came into view with the Iron Covenant colors posted on it. He brought the truck to a stop at the edge of the property and looked at Gene. You sure about this? The neighbor said. Gene opened the door before he could think about it too long. The walk from the truck to the clubhouse door was 40 feet. Gene would remember those 40 feet for the rest of his life. The way the gravel crunched under his boots in the cold morning. The way the motorcycles in the lot were lined up with that same precise military alignment. 19 of them, he counted, without meaning to chrome shining, and engines cold, and each one angled exactly like the last. The way the chain-link fence hummed faintly in the wind, the way his knees, which had served him badly for the better part of a decade, chose that moment to remind him of every mile they had carried him. He felt eyes on him before he reached the door. That specific prickle on the back of the neck that tells a man he is being assessed. He kept walking. He reached the door. He raised his hand. He knocked. For a long moment, nothing. The wind, the fence, the distant sound of a radio. He was raising his hand to knock again when he heard it, the deep scrape of a deadbolt, the groan of weight shifting against a frame built to withstand things. The door opened. The man who filled it was the largest Gene had ever stood in front of. He was broad across the shoulder as the doorframe itself, his beard gray-threaded and reaching his chest. His forearms crossed, invisible below, rolled his sleeves despite the morning cold, his eyes dark and steady and giving nothing away. The name worked in thread on his cut over the left breast read Bishop. Below it, the Iron Covenant patch, the same design Jean had seen on the fabric square in the wallet. Wade Briggs looked down at the small, gray-haired old man on his doorstep and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Help you." It did not sound like an offer of help. Behind him, Jean could see the room adjusting. Men rising from chairs, faces turning, the radio cutting off mid-song. The temperature in the air changed, not warmer. "I found something on Route 9, Jean said, and then his voice surprised him by working. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, the way you move your hands around men who are watching them, and he drew out the wallet and he held it up in the space between them. The effect was immediate. Bishop's eyes dropped to the wallet, and something happened in his face that Jean could not quite name. His right hand moved without thinking to his back pocket and found nothing there, the reflex of a man realizing he had lost something he had already been missing. His eyes came back up to Jean's face, and the calculation happening behind them was visible. "Found it on the shoulder of Route 9, Jean said. 4 days back. Your name's on the license. I didn't take anything out of it. The money's all there. All of it." From somewhere behind Bishop, a voice came out of the dim room, hard and flat. "How do we know that?" Jean kept his eyes on Bishop. "You don't," he said. "You count it and you see." Bishop reached out and took the wallet from Jean's outstretched hand. He opened it. His thick fingers moved through it carefully, deliberately, the way a man's hands move when they are looking for something specific. He counted the bills without appearing to count them, the practiced speed of a man who handles cash with regularity. Jean watched him confirm it. Every dollar. And then Bishop's thumb moved to the card slot. It found the license. It found the patch behind it. And then it found the edge of the folded paper, and it stopped. He did not unfold the paper. He looked at Jean. "Did you read this?" he said. "No," Jean said. "I saw it was there. I didn't take it out." Bishop studied him for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then his thumb moved past the paper and found the slot behind the cash. The slot Jean had pressed closed on the second morning without looking inside it. What Bishop drew out, holding it between 2 fingers, the way you hold something fragile, was a photograph. Not large, not new. Worn at the corners and faded the way photographs fade when they have been handled 10,000 times in quiet moments. The colors had shifted toward yellow and the edges had gone soft. Bishop held it and the room went utterly silent. Jean could not see what was in the photograph from where he stood, but he could see what it did to the man holding it. Bishop's face, which had been hard and closed and giving nothing away since the moment he opened the door, simply opened. Not by much, not for long, but in that brief, unguarded second, Jean saw something on the face of the most feared man in 3 counties that he recognized completely and without question. He had worn that same expression every morning for 14 months when he looked in the mirror. It was grief, pure and undecorated. "You didn't take this out," Bishop said. His voice had dropped several registers. It was nearly quiet. "You didn't even look." "It wasn't mine to look at," Jean said. Bishop turned the photograph around and now Jean could see it. A young man, early 20s, with Bishop's same dark eyes and a grin that belonged to someone who had not yet learned the full cost of things. He was sitting on a motorcycle, a hand raised toward the camera, completely at ease in the world. The kind of photograph you take of someone when you assume there will be other photographs. Bishop's thumb hovered just above the surface of the image, without quite touching the young man's face. "My son," he said. The name seemed to cost him something to release. "Danny, we lost him 3 years ago come September." The room was completely still. Jean understood from the quality of that stillness that this was not something the big man said often, that these words said aloud in this room were rare. "That money," Bishop continued, and his voice had gone careful and low, "I have been putting aside a little at a time for the better part of a year. It's for his headstone. The boy is still out there under a marker with a number on it because I never had it all at once." He stopped. He looked at the photograph. "You could have kept every dollar of it, and I'd never have known, and I'd never have had this back." He held the photograph up slightly, not displaying it, just acknowledging what it was. Jean said nothing for a moment. He thought about Maggie. He thought about the ring he kept turning on his finger in the chair that was always empty across the table, and the specific quality of a house from which a person has not been absent, but erased. He thought about the mornings he had sat with his coffee and talked to someone who was not there, and felt occasionally the strange and unscientific comfort of being heard. I understand, Jean said. My wife's been gone 14 months. I know what it is to carry something like that. The room had a different quality now. The men who had risen from their chairs had not sat back down, but the way they were standing had changed. The menace that had filled the doorway 3 minutes ago had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something else. Something that was trying to work out what kind of man it was looking at. Bishop looked at Jean for a long moment. He folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the slot where it had rested. He closed the wallet and held it. You walked out to this door, he said slowly, knowing whose door it was, to give me back my money and my boy's picture. He paused. What's your name? Jean Calloway. You from around here, Jean Calloway. All my life. Lived on the Route 9 property going on 41 years. Something shifted at the back of one of the other men's eyes. A man near the wall younger than Bishop, but not young, with a mechanic's hands and a watchful face. He straightened slightly. His expression changed in a way Jean could not yet read. Come inside, Bishop said. He stepped back from the door. You walked a long way in the cold. Least I can do is give you coffee before you go. Jean stood on the threshold. Out in the lot, he could hear the neighbor's truck still idling. He had not been sure the man would wait. He turned and raised a hand and the truck engine hesitated, then settled as the neighbor understood. Jean stepped across the threshold into the Iron Covenant MC clubhouse. Inside, it was nothing like the den of monsters the county had constructed for it. It was warm. Old couches with the stuffing worn down from years of use. A wooden bar scarred with ring marks and covered at one end with a coffee maker that had clearly been running since before dawn. Photographs on the walls, dozens of them, rides and rallies, and men with their arms around each other in summer and winter. The ongoing record of a group of people who had been doing something together for a long time. And in one corner, half hidden behind a route map taped to the wall, a set of children's drawings done in crayon, a lopsided sun and several stick figures of varying heights, taped there with the particular carelessness of something put up in a hurry and never taken down, because the person who put it up liked seeing it when they walked in. The men drifted over in ones and twos. Not aggressively, more the way men drift towards something their instincts can't quite categorize and feel the need to get a closer look at. Bishop poured Jean a cup of coffee and set it on the bar, and Jean wrapped his cold hands around it, and the warmth of it went up through his palms and into his wrists. It was the man with the mechanic's hands who spoke first. You're the Jean Calloway, whose wife was Maggie Calloway, he said. The nurse. Jean looked at him. She was. She used to look in on my mother when my mother was going through the bad year, about 5 years back. My mother didn't have anyone who knew what they were doing, and Maggie used to come by some evenings just to check. He paused. She never sent a bill. My mother talked about her until the day she died. I'm Jax Decker. Jean sat with that for a moment. The world being smaller than you thought it was, wearing a shape that surprised you. Maggie never mentioned it, Jean said. She wouldn't have, Jax said. That was how she was. The temperature of the room had changed again. Several of the men had heard this exchange and the effect was visible. Whatever Jean had been to them 3 minutes ago, he was something different now. Not a stranger at the door, something more complicated. They talked. The way men talk around a bar when the ice is broken and the coffee is working and the initial wariness has given way to curiosity. Jean learned that the man who had done 2 tours in the Middle East and walked with a bad knee was named Rufus Armstrong, and that he had done the tours because he believed in something and had come back because he was lucky, which he said with the specific flatness of a man who knows the cost of that luck in the faces of the men who were not. Jean learned that another man older who sat at the far end of the bar and said little had been with the Iron Covenant since before Bishop was president. Jean learned that the children's drawings in the corner had been put there by Bishop's niece when she was 7 and that she was now 11, and Bishop drove 40 minutes each way to watch her soccer games. And they learned things about Jean, not because he performed for them or worked to be liked, but because he was old enough to have run out of pretension, and the answers to their questions were simply the facts of his life. 40 years as a diesel mechanic, hired in at 17 as a parts runner, and had stayed until the shop closed. He knew engines the way some men know languages, the particular grammar of a seized bearing, the dialect of a timing chain, stretched past its useful life. That changed the temperature again, and in a specific way. Half the men in that room made their living with their hands and their knowledge of machines and the shop talk. that opened up between Jean and Jax had a quality to it that needed no translation. It was Jax who noticed about an hour in that the neighbor's truck was gone from the lot. "How'd you get out here?" Jax asked. "Neighbor dropped me." "Where's your vehicle?" "Dead in my yard. Been 2 months. Thrown bearing took the clutch with it." Jax looked at him. "You've been walking Route 9 every day for 2 months. "My knees don't love it," Jean said, attempting lightness and not quite achieving it. Bishop, who had been leaning against the bar and saying very little since the initial exchange, watching Jean with the careful attention of a man making a long assessment, set down his cup. "What kind of money trouble are you in?" he said. It was not the question Jean had expected. It was exactly the right question. He looked at it from across the bar and saw that Bishop had somehow already arrived at the answer, or most of it, and was not asking him to confess but to confirm. So Jean told them. He had not planned to. He had come to return a wallet and go home. But Jax's words about Maggie were still sitting in him, and the photograph of Danny Briggs was sitting in the wallet Bishop had set on the bar in front of him, and the coffee was warm, and these unlikely men had turned out to be human in a way that the county's version of them had not prepared him for, and it all came out. Margaret's illness. The 6 months, the money draining in the way money drains when a person you love is dying and the systems that are supposed to help have very small doors. The house falling behind, the letter from the bank with the red printing, the 9 days. And finally, after a pause in which the room had gone quiet enough to hear the coffee maker cycling off the name. Derek Holden. The man at the end of the bar, the oldest one, set his cup down with a deliberate care that communicated something that was not calm. Jax's face did something flat and controlled. Two men near the wall looked at each other and then at Bishop. Bishop said nothing. He had gone very still in a different way from when he had gone still over the photograph. The stillness of a man whose assessment has just arrived somewhere specific. "We know Holden," Jax said, not loudly, flatly the way you say the name of a thing you have reason not to like. "How do you know him?" Jean said. "Old man named Earl Webb. Lived 2 roads from the shop all his life. Retired railroad man, 81 years old. Holden got him on a terms dispute, ran up the legal costs until he couldn't fight anymore, then bought the property at half value." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Earl's vegetable garden is a parking lot now." He looked at Jean. "And there's a veteran down on Miller Street, Rufus Armstrong. Lost his lower leg in Fallujah, comes back, does all right for a while on the disability. Disability runs short and Holden is there friendly as spring." The murmur that went around the room was low and dark. Jean realized sitting at this bar with his coffee that he had walked into a room full of men who had watched Derek Holden do to their community exactly what he was doing to Jean. That each of them was carrying the specific weight of having seen it happen and having had no clear way to stop it. Holden had been careful. He had stayed inside the lines of the law because he knew exactly where those lines were and how close he could get to them. But he had made one miscalculation, the one that predators who work alone always eventually make. He had not counted on Jean Calloway picking up a wallet on Route 9 and choosing 3 days running not to solve his own problem with it. It was while Jean was thinking this that the door opened and a younger man came in, road cold and restless-eyed, and swept the room with a glance that lingered a half-second too long on Jean before sliding away. Bishop tracked the glance. Jean saw him do it and saw something register behind those dark eyes filed and set aside. Then Bishop reached out and put his hand on top of the wallet that was sitting on the bar between them. He did not pick it up. He just rested his palm on it lightly, the way you put your hand on something you are deciding what to do about. And then his phone on the bar lit up with a message from Jax's number, which was strange because Jax was standing 2 feet away. Jax had sent it from his phone without speaking, which meant he had not wanted everyone in the room to hear it. Bishop read it. He turned the phone face down. He looked at Jean. "Where did you say your house was?" he said, quietly. "Route 9, Jean said. Mile marker 11, the old Calloway property." Bishop looked at the phone on the bar, looked at Jean. "Holden filed an emergency foreclosure motion this morning," he said. "His attorney filed it at 8 a.m. when the county clerk's office opened. According to the county record, he's moved the date up." Jean felt the floor shift under him. "It isn't 9 days anymore," Bishop said. He met Jean's eyes. "You've got 72 hours. Jean sat with that number the way you sit with a thing that has changed the shape of everything around it. 72 hours. He turned his wedding ring on his finger and did the arithmetic he had been doing for the past 3 days, the same arithmetic that had kept him awake each of those nights, except now the numbers were different and worse. He had not been a man who panicked easily. 40 years under trucks and beside engines had cured him of the instinct because panic was the thing that made you tighten a bolt. One turn too many and shear the head off it and turn a 2-hour job into a day's work. Panic was what happened when you stopped reading the problem and started reacting to it. Gene had learned early and kept the lesson. But the arithmetic of 72 hours was a problem of a different kind. It was not a mechanical problem. It was not one he could think his way into a solution for while his hands were doing something useful. It was a problem that required things he did not have, specifically money and a lawyer. And the thing about not having money was that it made getting a lawyer a circle with no entrance point. He realized the room had gotten very quiet again. Bishop was watching him, not with the cold assessment of the doorway, with something more patient than that and more careful, the way you watch a man who is trying not to let a thing show that is showing anyway. "I don't have a lawyer," Gene said. He said it quietly and without self-pity. It was simply the fact. "I know you don't," Bishop said. Jax was looking at his phone. He set it down and looked at Bishop, and there was a conversation in that look that happened in the shorthand of men who have known each other a long time. Something was being offered and considered and either accepted or declined in about 2 seconds. Gene watched it happen without fully understanding what it was. "Frank Carver," Jack said. Bishop nodded once. Gene looked between them. "Franklin Carver," Jack said to Gene. "He's a real estate attorney out of Lexington. Good one. He did work for my sister when she had a dispute over her property line 6 years ago. Took the other side apart so cleanly they didn't even want to appeal. He does this kind of work." He paused. "I mean specifically this kind of work. Predatory contract disputes, fraudulent pressure campaigns. He's seen Holden's kind before, maybe Holden specifically." "I can't afford a Lexington attorney," Gene said. "We know," Bishop said. "We're not asking you to." Gene looked at him. "You'd do that for a man you met an hour ago." "Not for a man I met an hour ago," Bishop said. He picked up the wallet from the bar. He held it in both hands for a moment, the weight of it, the familiar worn leather. For a man who had the answer to his own problem in his pocket for 4 days and made the harder choice. He set it down again. A man like that deserves someone in his corner when his corner needs filling. The room, which had been quiet, made a collective sound that was not quite words but functioned as agreement. Gene looked around at the faces arranged in a loose half circle along the bar and the nearby chairs. 19 men in their colors, the Iron Covenant MC, the ones the county crossed the street to avoid, and he thought about the last 18 months. The isolation of them, the way grief had a quality of reducing your world until it was exactly as small as your own house, your own table, your own unanswered correspondence, your own conversations with a woman who was no longer there to respond. He thought about Pearl Monroe, who called him every Sunday and brought him casseroles and had tried to drive him here this morning before her battery failed. He thought about Maggie, who had gone by evenings to check on a woman she didn't know because the woman needed checking on and had never sent a bill and had never mentioned it to Gene because she was not the kind of person who kept a ledger of her kindnesses. And he thought about the wallet, the 3 days he had sat with it, the way each morning he had looked at the money and known with a clarity that was almost physical that he was not going to keep it. Not because he was a saint or because the temptation wasn't real, because the temptation had been completely real, more real on some mornings than others. But because Maggie had asked him for a specific promise in a room that smelled like antiseptic, in the particular stillness of a hospital at 2 in the morning, and that promise was the last thing she had needed from him, and it was the one thing in his life he could still give her. He had not let himself think too clearly about why he had kept it for 3 days before moving. He thought about it now. The 3 days had not been indecision. They had been the last of the battle. The point at which a man who already knows what he is going to do still has to fully feel the weight of the other option, the road not taken, the comfortable and easy, and no one would blame you solution that he was choosing not to take. He had needed 3 days to feel the full cost of the choice so that when he made it with his eyes open. "I didn't come here for help," Gene said to Bishop. He meant it as information, not ingratitude. "I know that too," Bishop said. "You came here because it was the right thing to do. And now we're going to do something because it's the right thing to do. And neither of us needs to make more of it than that." Gene was quiet for a moment. "The man who came in when you got the message," he said, "the young one. He looked at me like he knew something he didn't want to." The room shifted slightly, a subtle change in the way people held themselves. Bishop looked at Jean with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion by watching something happen in someone else's face. His name is Kyle, Bishop said. Don't worry about Kyle right now. But he said it in a way that told Jean Kyle was something Bishop was going to worry about himself and soon. Jax was on the phone, not performing a call for Jean's benefit, but actually making one step partly away from the bar, speaking in a low and efficient shorthand. Jean caught the name Carver twice, caught the phrase emergency injunction, caught the measured quality of the voice of a man giving someone else information he trusted them to know what to do with. When he came back, he set the phone on the bar. Frank can be at your house by 4 this afternoon, Jack said. He wants to see everything Holden has ever sent you. Every letter, every offer, every legal notice. Everything. It's in a drawer in my kitchen, Jean said. Good place for it, Jack said. Jean picked up his coffee cup and found it empty. Without being asked, Bishop refilled it from the carafe behind the bar. The gesture so automatic it seemed to be something he did without thinking. Jean thought about what that gesture meant, the small hospitality of it, the assumption of welcome that it contained. He thought about Pearl Monroe at home with her dead battery who had wanted to be here but could not. He would call her when he got home. She would want to know about all of this, and she deserved to hear it from him before she invented a version of it on her own. He thought about the photograph of Danny Briggs, young and grinning, frozen at the moment before whatever had taken him. He thought about Bishop holding that photograph with his thumb just above the surface without quite touching it, the specific restraint of a man who handled something fragile. You said 3 years, Jean said. Your son. Bishop did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands on the bar. Accident, he said. On the road. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just a bad night and a wet road and a driver who didn't see him. He stopped. He was 24. I'm sorry, Jean said. He said it without decoration because it didn't need any. He liked mechanics, Bishop said. It seemed like a non sequitur until it wasn't. Engines, he had your gift for it. We used to work on bikes together in the evenings. He looked at the photograph in the wallet, which was face down on the bar now. I keep thinking I'm going to turn around one day, and he'll be standing there with a torque wrench asking me something about a carb adjustment. Jean understood that. He kept setting 2 cups out in the morning. He kept buying the kind of coffee Maggie had preferred, even though he had always liked a different kind. He bought it every week and drank it because it was there, and it took him 3 weeks to realize why he was buying it. The grief in that room between those 2 men had a texture to it that was different from the grief Jean had been carrying alone in his house for 14 months. It had a witness, someone who could confirm its dimensions. That was the thing about sharing a loss with someone who had their own. It did not make either loss smaller, but it made it less isolating. And isolation, Jean had discovered, was how grief became something else, something harder and darker and less manageable. The money I was putting aside, Bishop said, for Danny Stone, I'd had it for a while, a year more. I was getting close. He looked at Jean. He's still under a number. He won't be, Jean said. It came out with a certainty he had not planned. But he meant it, and Bishop heard that he meant it, and something settled between them that did not need to be spoken about further. Outside, through the narrow windows of the clubhouse, Jean could see the morning light changing. The flat gray of early October was warming to something slightly better, the kind of fall day that in Kentucky could go warm enough by afternoon to sit on a porch without a coat. He thought about his porch. The view of the field from it, the one Maggie had planted sunflowers along the edge of the first summer. They owned the house and had replanted every year since, and which Jean had planted alone this past spring because he did not know how to stop. He thought about Holden's clean car in his driveway. He thought about 72 hours. What do you need from me, he said to Bishop, for the attorney to help. Tell him the truth, Bishop said. All of it the same way you told us. Don't leave anything out, and don't try to make it look better than it is. Frank works best when he has the whole story. I can do that, Jean said. And Jean. Bishop paused. The room had gotten quiet again, not with tension, but with the quality of attention that meant something important was being said. Whatever happens with Holden in the house, you understand that you walked into a room full of strangers and treated them like they deserve honesty. That counts. That counts more than you might think coming from the direction it came from. Jean looked down at his coffee cup. He was not a man who took compliments easily. Maggie had told him that more than once with the fond exasperation of a woman who understood her husband's vocabulary of deflection very well. I did what was right, he said. That's all. That's not all, Bishop said. That's everything. The coffee maker on the bar finished its cycle with a soft click. Somewhere outside, a bird was working at something in the fence line. The morning light came through the windows at a low angle and lay across the photographs on the walls, the rallies and the rides, and the men who had been doing this together for years. This shared life of roads and machines and loyalty that the county had decided to be afraid of. Gene thought that he had spent his whole life around men who worked with their hands and knew what a machine owed you and what you owed it in return, and that the vocabulary of that world was the same, whether you were under a truck or on a motorcycle, and that the county had been wrong about the men in this room in the specific way you were wrong about something when you only looked at the surface of it and decided that was enough to know. He had been wrong too. He admitted it to himself without drama. He had carried the county's version of these men in him when he walked across that lot this morning, and the county's version had been made of rumor and assumption and the very human instinct to be afraid of what looked different from you. And what he had found on the other side of the door he had knocked on, because a dead woman had asked him to be the man she married, was this: grief, loyalty, coffee on a cold morning, a mechanic's hands, crayon drawings of suns and stick figures taped to a wall because someone who mattered had put them there. His phone was in his coat pocket. He reached for it and sent Pearl Monroe a message that said, "Only I'm all right. More to tell you when I get home. Tell you everything." Pearl's reply came in 30 seconds. "I know you are. I told you you would be." Gene smiled. He could not help it. He sat in the Iron Covenant clubhouse on the morning that had begun with 72 hours on the clock, and for the first time since the letter with the red printing had arrived in his mailbox, he did not feel entirely alone. That was the thing about walking through the door you were afraid to walk through. On the other side of it was never quite what the fear had told you it would be. Franklin Carver arrived at Gene's house at 4:15, which meant he had gotten in his car in Lexington before Jax even finished making the call. He was a compact man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that had seen considerable use, in a manner that Gene found immediately reassuring, which was the quality of a very good attorney, the ability to be reassuring without being soft. He sat at Gene's kitchen table, the same table that had held the wallet for 3 days, and the bank letter before that, and he went through every document Gene put in front of him. He went through them the way Jax had described thoroughly, and without drama, asking specific questions in a specific order that told Gene he had asked these questions many times before and knew exactly which answers mattered. He spread the letters from Holden's office across the table. He aligned them chronologically. He read each one with his glasses slightly down his nose and occasionally circled something with a pencil. When he was done, he took his glasses off and set them on the table. "How long has Derek Holden been in this county?" he said. "About 4 years," Gene said. "That's when people started talking about him." People being neighbors. My neighbor, Pearl Monroe. She keeps track of things. Carver wrote something in his notepad. "The language in this third letter is not legal," he said. "It implies a timeline for legal action that does not reflect actual foreclosure procedure in Kentucky. It's designed to make you believe you have less time than you do and fewer options than you do." He tapped the letter. "That is a pressure tactic, not a statement of fact. And it is the kind of tactic that has a name in the statutes." Gene watched him. "What kind of name?" "The kind I can use," Carver said. He pulled out 2 more sheets from the bottom of the pile. Documents Gene had barely looked at because they had arrived inside a larger packet and he had not understood them. Carver looked at these with a different kind of attention, more focused. He held one of them closer to the light from the kitchen window. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "when exactly did your wife pass?" 14 months ago, November of last year. "And in the weeks before she passed, was she on significant medication? Pain management sedatives?" "Yes," Gene said. "The last 2 months were heavy. She was on a morphine protocol." Carver set the document down and looked at Gene steadily. "This document," he said, "is a limited power of attorney authorizing Derek Holden's company to act on your property's behalf in certain zoning and permitting matters. It bears your wife's signature." Gene stared at it. "Maggie never signed anything for Holden." "I would not expect her to have," Carver said. "She was on a morphine protocol. What she may have signed, if she signed anything at all, she would not have understood the nature of. And it is possible she signed nothing, and this signature was produced by other means." He folded his hands on the table. "This is not a civil matter, Mr. Calloway. If this signature is fraudulent, and I believe it is, this is a federal crime." The kitchen was very quiet. Gene could hear the refrigerator cycling. He could hear his own breathing. "Maggie knew something was wrong," he said slowly. She said something once the last month about a man from a company coming to see her at the hospital. I was at the hardware store. She was agitated about it when I got back. I told her not to worry. He stopped. I told her not to worry. You didn't know, Carver said. I should have pushed harder on it. Mr. Calloway. Carver waited until Jean met his eyes. You were managing your wife's final weeks. You were doing what you were able to do. What happened afterward is not a failure on your part. It is a crime on someone else's. He gathered the documents and began sorting them into separate piles. I'm going to need to make some calls tonight. There are things in this paperwork that need to go to people above my level. What kind of people? Jean said. Carver looked at him. The kind with a federal jurisdiction, he said. After Carver left, Jean sat at his table for a long time. The kitchen was dark by now, and he had not turned on the light, and the house was exactly as quiet as it always was at this hour, which was very quiet. He turned his wedding ring on his finger. He thought about Maggie in the hospital, agitated the man from the company who had visited while Jean was at the hardware store, the paperwork she had perhaps been handed, perhaps had not fully understood her signature at the bottom of something she had not chosen to sign. He felt a specific kind of anger that was cold rather than hot, the patient kind, the kind that did not rush and did not waste itself on things that did not matter and knew exactly where it needed to go. He picked up the phone and called Pearl Monroe. Pearl listened without interrupting, which was not natural to her, and told Jean she understood the gravity of what she was hearing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Maggie knew, Pearl said. She always knew. She must have said something or written something. Carver thinks so too. Jean? Pearl's voice had a quality he recognized, the quality of someone who has just thought of something. After Maggie passed, you packed up the hospice bags, the things from her room at the hospital. You put everything in boxes. Yes. Where did you put them? Jean sat up straight here. They're in the hall closet, he said. I couldn't go through them. I haven't opened them since I brought them home. Silence. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Pearl said. Don't touch them until I get there. She was there in 9. They opened the boxes at the kitchen table, Pearl and Jean, in the light of the overhead lamp, going through things slowly. Maggie's reading glasses in their case. A book she had been working through, the bookmarks still in it. Small personal items accumulated over weeks in a hospital room. Pearl went through each box with a methodical care that Jean could not quite manage himself. His hands were steadier than he had expected them to be, but his breathing was not. It was Pearl who found it. A standard white envelope sealed with Jean's name written on the front in Maggie's handwriting. Below his name, in her precise nurse's script, a single additional line, in case of anything with the man from Holloway Properties. Jean looked at the envelope. He looked at Maggie's handwriting. He had not seen her handwriting in 14 months. The specific slope of it, the way she made her capital G. He was very still. Pearl put her hand on top of his briefly. Then Jean opened it. Inside was a letter 3 pages in Maggie's handwriting. The letters getting slightly less precise toward the 3rd page as her hands had grown tired or the medication had shifted. She had written it sometime in the last weeks, the handwriting dated at the top by a date Jean recognized. November 3rd, 12 days before she died. She had written what happened. The man from Holloway Properties who had come to her room while Jean was out, who had been friendly and sympathetic, who had produced papers related to a property matter, she had not fully understood what she was signing. The medication blurred certain things, but afterward, and she had felt wrong about it, had written down the man's name and the company name and the nature of what he had said. She had not wanted to worry Jean while she was still alive. She had felt she wrote that she was perhaps confused and that it was probably nothing. But she had not been confused, and she had written down everything she could remember. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, in the slightly unsteady handwriting of the last weeks, she had written, "If this turns out to be something, tell the right people. I always trusted you to know who the right people are." Jean folded the letter. He held it in both hands. He sat with it. Pearl was very quiet. "The right people," Jean said. Pearl looked at him. "You already met them today," she said. The next morning, Jean drove Jax's loaner truck to the Iron Covenant clubhouse, which felt different in daylight on a day when he was expected. The gates were open. Jax met him in the lot. Inside, Bishop was at the bar with coffee, and Carver was already there, having driven back from Lexington, and there was someone new as well. A woman mid-50s, professional, bearing with a notepad on the bar in front of her. "This is Sandra Keller," Carver said. "She is with the FBI." Jean sat down. Sandra Keller had a quality of absolute stillness that Jean associated with people who had learned to let others fill silences because the things that came out of silences were useful. She looked at the letter Maggie had written. She looked at the documents Carver had flagged. She asked Jean several questions in a specific order that told him she was confirming things she already mostly knew. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "how much do you know about the property behind your house? The field east of your back fence?" Jean looked at her. "I know it's been fallow about 3 years. Before that, it was the Merriweather property. Old Arnie Merriweather sold it when his wife passed." "Do you know who purchased it?" "Not specifically. Some company." Keller looked at Carver. Carver looked at Jean. "Holloway Properties acquired it 18 months ago," Carver said. "It is currently the subject of a federal permitting dispute, a dispute that Holloway Properties would resolve substantially in their favor if they also owned the Calloway parcel. What sits between your land and theirs?" Jean looked at the table. "The zoning would change," Keller said. "With both parcels, they would have the minimum combined acreage for a logistics classification. There is a federal distribution contract being awarded in this county in 11 months. The company that holds the right parcel in the right configuration will be positioned to bid." She folded her hands. "Your property, Mr. Calloway, is not worth what Holden is offering you for your house. It is worth roughly 14 to 16 times that amount to him." Jean sat with that number for a moment. "He was never going to let you keep it," Bishop said from down the bar. He had been listening without commenting. The foreclosure was the backup plan. The pressure campaign was the primary. He needed you scared and isolated and feeling like you had no choice. "He was right about the scared part," Jean said. "But wrong about the isolated part," Bishop said. "That's the difference." There was one other thing that needed to be said, and Jean said it now because it was better said directly than discovered by accident. "There's a man in your club," Jean said to Bishop. "Young one, came in yesterday morning and looked at me the way a man looks when he knows something that isn't supposed to be known yet." The room was quiet. Bishop looked at Jean for a moment. Then he looked at the bar. Then he looked up and called a name. The young man Kyle came into the room from the back hallway where he had apparently been waiting to be not called. He was about 25 with the particular self-possession of someone who had rehearsed a version of this moment and was discovering that the rehearsed version was not quite sufficient for the actual one. Bishop did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He asked the young man a series of questions in the same flat, deliberate tone he used for everything, and the young man answered them slowly at first and then more quickly, as the relief of being truthful overtook the anxiety of not being. Holden's company had made contact 4 weeks ago. They had wanted to know who Jean Calloway was to the Iron Covenant, whether Bishop would protect him, what the club's intentions were regarding Holden's foreclosure timeline. Kyle had been offered money. He had taken some of it. He had reported that Jean had appeared at the clubhouse, that Bishop had seemed invested in helping him. "That is why Holden moved up the timeline," Carver said when Kyle finished. "He knew he'd lost the element of isolation. He moved to foreclose before we could organize." Bishop was very quiet. Kyle looked at him. He looked younger than 25 in that moment. He looked like someone waiting to be told what the cost of something was going to be. Bishop looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You're going to go to that woman." He meant Agent Keller. "You're going to tell her exactly what was said to you and exactly what you said back. Every conversation, every amount, every contact. And then you're going to come back here and we are going to discuss at length what membership in this club means and what it requires of you." He paused. "Do you understand me?" Kyle said he did. "Then go," Bishop said. Kyle went. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Bishop turned back to the bar as though a minor administrative matter had been resolved, and Carver resumed speaking, and the work of the next 72 hours began to take its shape. It was Jax who drove out to find Rufus Armstrong. Jean had not met Rufus yet. He knew the name from what Jax had described the day before the veteran, the man who had lost his lower leg in Fallujah and come home to find Holden working his way through his property on the same playbook, and who had lost. Jax had told Jean that Rufus lived out on Miller Street in a house that needed work and did not receive visitors easily. Jean went with him. The house on Miller Street had a ramp installed alongside the 3 front steps, the kind of addition that told you something about the degree of permanence of whatever had required it. The yard was clean, more cared for than the house flowers along the south fence that someone tended with intention. Jax knocked. After a while, the door opened, and a man in his late 60s with a face that had been outdoors a great deal and a left leg that ended at mid-calf where it met the polished shaft of a prosthetic, looked at them without warmth. "I'm not interested," Rufus Armstrong said. "I know," Jack said. "Give us 10 minutes. I said I was done with all of that. I lost. You can't give me the house back. You can't give me the years back. I'm not going through it again." "I'm not asking you to go through it again," Jack said. "I'm asking you to help make sure someone else doesn't have to." Rufus looked at Gene. He assessed him with the direct and uncomplicated evaluation of a man who had spent time in places where reading people quickly was a survival skill. "You're the man from Route 9, he said. Gene looked at him. "How do you know about that?" "Pearl Monroe told the Methodist congregation," Rufus said. "You're famous." There was a long pause. Gene did not know what to do with being famous at the Methodist congregation. "Come in," Rufus said. They sat in a living room that was neat and spare. The room of a man who lived alone and had organized his space around his specific needs. Everything within reach, nothing wasted. Rufus listened to what Gene told him, listened to what Carver had found, listened to what Keller's involvement meant. He listened without commenting, which turned out to be not indifference, but the specific, focused attention of someone taking in information before deciding how to respond to it. "The signature," Rufus said when Gene got to that part. "They did the same thing to me. Different mechanism. They got a family friend to co-sign a document I hadn't authorized. Man thought he was helping. By the time I understood what had happened, the property was already in dispute, and I didn't have the legal resources to fight it." "Would you testify to that?" Gene said. Rufus was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window, the south light coming in across the flower beds. "I lost a lot," he said. "My leg that was the war, the house that was Holden. And there is something particular about losing a thing to a man in a good coat who uses lawyers instead of weapons, because at least in the war I understood what was happening to me and why." He stopped. "I have thought since then that I did not fight hard enough, that I gave up too quickly." He looked at Gene. "But the truth is I had nothing to fight with," he said. "No lawyer, no money, no one who knew how to make the machinery work. I was alone." "You're not alone now," Gene said. Rufus looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Jax. "Same deal as Gene," Jack said. "Frank Carver. We cover it." Rufus was quiet for another long moment. Outside, a car went down Miller Street, and the sound of it faded, and the room was quiet again. "All right," Rufus said. It came out rough, like a word that had been held back a long time and was finally being released. "All right, I'll testify." On the way back to the clubhouse, Gene looked out the truck window at the county roads going by the particular fall light on the fields, the colors changing in the tree lines. He thought about what Maggie had written. "Tell the right people. I always trusted you to know who they are." He turned the ring on his finger. He thought he was beginning to know. That evening back at his house, he went through the rest of the closet boxes alone. Not because he was looking for anything else, but because Maggie had wanted him to. Because the letter she had left was a message, and the message was not just the legal information it contained, but the thing underneath the legal information, which was, "I trusted you with this. I knew you would come to it when you needed to." He found at the bottom of the last box, beneath the folded blanket from her hospital chair, a small notebook. Her handwriting on the cover, neat and deliberate, things worth keeping track of. He opened it. It was not about Holden. It was older than that. It was a record of things she had thought worth noting over the years. Small observations, a line about the way the light fell on the sunflowers in August, a note about a patient who had recovered against expectations, a line about Gene from perhaps 15 years ago that read, "He thinks he keeps things to himself, but actually he tells me everything eventually. It just takes him time to find the words. I love that about him." Gene sat on the floor of the hallway with the notebook in his hands until the room was fully dark, and then sat a while longer. Then he got up, turned on the kitchen light, and called Franklin Carver. "I found something else," he said when Carver answered. "It's not legal documents, but I think you'll want to hear about it anyway." "Tell me," Carver said. So Gene told him. He told him about the notebook and what was in it and what it said about Maggie, and he told him the line about the sunflowers and the line about the patient and the line about Gene himself that was 15 years old and still completely accurate. And Carver, who was a professional man with a full case and a significant legal battle to prepare for, listened to all of it without interrupting. Because sometimes that was what a person needed, not a solution, a witness. Carver let the silence run for a moment after Gene finished. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was the most remarkable person I ever knew," Gene said. "And I knew her for 43 years, and I was still surprised by her regularly." "Hold on to that notebook," Carver said. Not for legal purposes, just because you should. After he hung up, Gene set Maggie's notebook on the kitchen table next to her letter. He looked at them side by side in the kitchen light, his wife's handwriting on both the practical document of a woman who knew something wrong had happened and had prepared for the possibility that it would need to be addressed, and the small private record of a woman who had simply been paying attention to her life. He thought about the phone number at the bottom of Maggie's letter, the one she had written below everything else with a name beside it. If it comes to it, he had asked Carver about it, and Carver had gone very quiet and then said that number was a federal contact, that he did not know how Maggie had come to have it, but that it suggested someone had already spoken with her, that she had already taken steps before she wrote the letter. Gene picked up the phone. It was nearly 11 at night. He called the number. It rang twice. A voice alert despite the hour answered. "This is Special Agent Keller." Gene paused. "You already know who I am," he said. "I've been expecting your call for 2 years, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Your wife contacted this office approximately 26 months ago. She provided us with a significant amount of documentation and testimony related to Holloway Properties operations across 4 counties. We have been building this case since then." A pause. "We needed a living witness from the Harlan County operation to close the evidentiary gap. We were hoping you would find that letter." Gene sat at his kitchen table, at the table where he and Maggie had eaten breakfast for 41 years. He sat very still. "She knew," he said. "She was thorough," Keller said. "She was also very concerned about your safety. She asked us to wait until you found the letter on your own, rather than approaching you directly. She felt it was important that you come to it." A brief pause. "She said you were stubborn about being helped, but very good at helping others, and that the best way to get you somewhere was to let you think you got there yourself." Gene was quiet for a moment. "That is," he said, "entirely accurate." A sound came out of him then that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but contained elements of both the specific release of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been told that the person he carried it for was watching over him the whole time. "What do you need from me?" he said when he could speak clearly again. "Everything you have," Keller said, "and your testimony at the federal hearing. We have a date, 3 weeks. "I'll be there," Gene said. He set the phone down. He sat in the quiet of the house. He put his hand flat on the kitchen table, on the worn wood of it, on the surface that had held 41 years of breakfast plates and evening cups, and the hands of 2 people who had talked at it and argued at it and laughed at it and been silent at it in all the many varieties of silence that a long marriage accumulates. Outside, the night was perfectly still. "Thank you, Maggie," he said to the empty chair. The empty chair said nothing, but the stillness of the house for the first time in 14 months did not feel like absence. It felt like presence, like a woman who had planned carefully and trusted completely and was in her own precise and thorough way still here. The 3 weeks that followed were the most organized Gene Calloway had been since before Maggie's illness. He had always been good at organization, the natural discipline of a mechanic who understood that a misplaced tool cost more time than a found one, that the most efficient way to do a job was to lay it out completely before you started. But since Maggie's death, that organizational quality had gone somewhere he couldn't quite reach. He had kept the house maintained and the bills addressed and the minimum functional order of a life intact, but the deeper organizational quality, the planning kind, the sense of looking forward with intention, had been missing. Now it was back. Each morning he drove Jax's loaner truck to the clubhouse, where Carver had set up a working space at the end of the bar, and they went through documents. Gene learned more in those 3 weeks about real estate law and federal fraud statutes than he had absorbed in his previous 72 years combined. He learned what a chain of title was and what happened when it was disrupted. He learned the specific legal term for what had been done with Maggie's signature, and it was not a comfortable term. He learned what the federal sentencing guidelines said about the number of victims involved in a fraud scheme of this type, and he sat with those numbers quietly and without comment. Pearl Monroe came to the clubhouse on the second day. She marched in with a covered dish and introduced herself to Bishop with a firmness that suggested she was prepared to disapprove of him if necessary, and had decided instead to reserve judgment. Bishop poured her coffee and pulled out a chair, and they talked for 40 minutes at the far end of the bar, while Gene and Carver worked through documents. And at the end of 40 minutes, Pearl had Gene observed, apparently revised her judgment upward significantly, because she refilled Bishop's cup without being asked, and they were discussing the late summer weather with the ease of two people who had been finding things in common. She's something, Jack said quietly to Jean. She was Maggie's best friend, Jean said. She measures up to Maggie's standards or she doesn't bother with you. What are Maggie's standards? Are you honest? Are you kind? Are you someone who shows up when things are hard? Jean paused. In that order. Jax looked at Bishop and Pearl. He passes, he said. Yes, Jean said, he does. It was during the second week that Carver sat down with Jean and told him something he had not expected. The fraudulent signature was one charge. The fraudulent signature being applied to a document with federal permitting implications was a second heavier charge. The systematic pattern of this behavior across 4 counties, which the FBI's records confirmed, extended to 23 documented victims over 6 years, constituted a third category of charge that Carver described with a precision that left no doubt about the trajectory. Holden had been careful, but Holden had also been doing it long enough that the accumulation of evidence had a weight that carefulness could not offset. He will have a good attorney, Carver said. He can afford one. That attorney will argue various mitigations and file various motions, and the process will be what it is. But the evidence is substantial and the federal interest is substantial, and the outcome is not in significant doubt. He folded his hands. I want you to be prepared for the fact that this will take time. Federal cases move at their own pace. The hearing in 3 weeks is not the end. It is the beginning of the end. What does that mean for my house? Jean said. Holden's emergency foreclosure motion was based on the fraudulent power of attorney, Carver said. Once we file the response I have prepared, which will be tomorrow morning, that motion will be challenged on its foundational document. The challenge will result in a stay of proceedings. The foreclosure will not proceed while the underlying fraud is under investigation. He looked at Jean. Your house is safe. Jean sat with that. It's safe, he said. Yes, Carver said. Jean turned his ring on his finger. He thought about the bank letter with the red printing and the 9 days that had become 72 hours. He thought about the wallet on Route 9. He thought about a stone with a number instead of a name on it. I need to talk to you about something else, he said to Carver. Not related to my case. Carver waited. The money in Bishop's wallet, Jean said. The money he was saving for his son's headstone. I want to know if there is a way to make sure he doesn't lose it again. He carries it in cash because he doesn't fully trust other systems, and I understand that, but it isn't safe. Carver looked at him for a moment. That is not a legal matter. I know it isn't, but you know things about how things work. Is there a straightforward way? Carver thought about it. He named 2 options, a credit union account with a specific structure and a straightforward arrangement with a monument company for a direct deposit toward a commission. Jean listened. He asked which was simpler. Carver said the monument company. Can you help me arrange that, Jean said, without telling Bishop until it's done. Carver looked at him over his glasses. You understand that is an arrangement you would be initiating on behalf of someone who did not ask you to. He kept faith with his son for 3 years, Jean said. The least I can do is make sure it doesn't get lost again. Carver made a note in his notepad. I can arrange it, he said. The morning of the federal hearing, Jean woke at 5 and lay in the dark and went through the things he knew. He knew what he was going to say and the order he was going to say it in because he had gone over it with Keller twice and with Carver 3 times and once on his own at the kitchen table with Maggie's letter in front of him to keep his mind on what mattered. He knew the hearing was not the end. He knew the outcome was, as Carver said, not in significant doubt. He knew that in the legal sense, the most important things had already been established. What he did not know was how it would feel to sit in a federal courtroom and say aloud the name of the man who had visited his wife's hospital room while she was dying and handed her papers. She did not fully understand the man who had been working patient and methodical to take from Jean the last physical connection to the 41 years of his marriage. He got up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the early light come up over the field, the long field to the east that had been the Meriwether property and was now Holloway Properties and was behind the legal action. That was the reason for this morning. He looked at the fence line at the back of his property. He looked at the fallow field beyond it. He thought about 14 times the value. He thought about a federal logistics contract and a man who had decided that a grieving 72-year-old mechanic on a dead truck was the easiest thing between him and a very large sum of money. He finished his coffee. He put on his good coat. He went outside and got in Jax's loaner truck, which he had been driving for 3 weeks now, and he drove to the courthouse. They were all there when he arrived. Carver in his suit with the well-used briefcase, Keller with her specific stillness, Rufus Armstrong on his prosthetic, with his back very straight and his face set with a particular expression that Jean recognized as the face of a man who has decided to do a hard thing and is not going to let anything between him and it. Pearl Monroe in her good coat, who had not been asked to testify but had come anyway because she was Pearl Monroe and she went where she was needed. And Bishop, Wade Briggs, standing on the courthouse steps in his cut, his arms folded alone because he was always alone in the specific way that large men with quiet presences were alone, a clearance of space around them that other people created without thinking. He looked at Jean when Jean came up the steps, and he nodded once, the nod of a man who does not make a large thing out of a thing that needs no enlargement. Jean nodded back. They went in. The federal courtroom in Lexington was a serious room. High-ceiling wood paneling that had absorbed 30 years of serious proceedings and given nothing back a light through the high windows that arrived with the quality of something that did not take sides. Judge Elaine Weaver presided from the bench with a face that Jean had spent 40 years learning to read in other contexts, the face of someone who had heard a very large number of stories and was not interested in being told a version of them. She was a compact woman in her 60s, with reading glasses she removed and replaced with a precision that seemed to indicate something about her general relationship to precision. She had a reputation, Carver had told Jean in the parking lot that morning, for impatience with theater and complete attention to fact. She will like you, Carver had said, and when Jean asked why, Carver said, because you are not going to perform for her. You are going to tell her what happened. Holden was at the defendant's table with two attorneys, and the composed expression of a man who had been in rooms like this before and was not particularly frightened of them. He was 50, perhaps 52, well-dressed in the way that communicated a careful relationship with appearance. He did not look at Jean when Jean entered. He looked at his attorney's notes. He looked at his phone, which one of the attorneys took from him when the bailiff indicated. He looked, Jean thought, like a man running a particular kind of internal calculation. Holden's lead attorney was a tall man named Phillips, who had the specific quality of controlled confidence that comes from winning cases you should not have won. He had filed 4 motions in the 2 weeks prior, each of them targeted at a different pillar of the prosecution's case, and each of them had been denied, but the filing of them was a message. Phillips was not frightened either. What Phillips had filed the day before was the thing that had made Carver call Jean at 9 in the evening with a measured voice that was measuring very carefully. A counterfiling, an affidavit attached to supporting documents asserting that the Calloway property had been sold by Eugene Calloway personally in a voluntary private transaction 14 months prior. The date on the documents was 3 weeks after Maggie's death. The signature was Jean's. Jean had not signed any such document. The signature was very good. It was good enough that Jean had looked at it for a full minute before he could confirm with certainty that he had not made it. It was the kind of forgery that was built on samples that had studied the original long enough to reproduce its habits without quite getting the intuitive ease of the real thing. Jean's real signature had a slight leftward slant in the G that the forged version overcorrected on. But it took a close look to see that. He anticipated this, Keller had said when they reviewed it together that evening. The fraudulent power of attorney on your wife was the primary mechanism. When we began to move on that he prepared a secondary claim, it is a pattern. He does not abandon a position, he builds defenses in depth. He used my signature, Jean said. Yes, on a document saying I sold the house I've lived in for 41 years. Yes, while I was still living in it. Yes. Jean had looked at the signature for a long time. Then he had looked at Carver. What do we do, he said. Carver set his pen down. We show the court who you are, he said. We put the whole picture in front of a judge who is capable of reading it. The forgery is a counter move. It is a strong one, but it requires the court to believe that you acted in a way that is inconsistent with everything else in evidence about who you are and how you behave. He paused. A man who walked an Iron Covenant wallet 20 miles to return it, who did not look at the contents, who sat with a table full of money for 3 days before choosing the harder path, does not simultaneously sign his house away in a private transaction and then spend the next 14 months fighting to keep it. Jean looked at him. The character evidence, Carver said, is the answer to the forgery. In the courtroom, Phillips opened for the defense with a smoothness that Jean had to acknowledge as impressive. He built the counter-narrative efficiently. A voluntary transaction between a grieving widower and a development company executed in private because Gene had been overwhelmed by his circumstances, disputed now only because Gene had been subsequently approached by parties with an interest in complicating the transaction. He gestured toward the Iron Covenant presence toward Bishop in the growlery in a way that was not quite explicit and did not need to be. Judge Weaver listened with her glasses in her hand and her face revealing nothing. Carver presented first. He was precise and organized and did not editorialize. He laid out the chronology, the fraudulent power of attorney on Margaret Calloway, the forged property transaction, the 23 additional documented victims across 4 counties, the FBI's 2-year investigation, and the records of systematic predatory practice. He presented it the way you present a machine whose function you want someone to understand component by component in the order that showed how they work together. Then Gene testified. He told the truth. He told it in the same way he had told it at the bar of the Iron Covenant Clubhouse without performance and without omission, in the voice of a man who had decided that the truth was the only thing he had that could not be taken from him. He told it about Maggie's illness and the money and the bank letter and the wallet on Route 9 and the 3 days at the table. He told it about the signature on the document he had allegedly signed and the specific way he could tell it was not his. Judge Weaver asked him 3 questions during his testimony. Each one was precise and went exactly to the center of something. And then Rufus Armstrong testified. He came up the aisle on his prosthetic with his back straight and his face set in the expression Gene had recognized on the courthouse steps, the face of a man who has made a decision and is walking through it. He took the stand. He was sworn. He looked at the judge, not at Holden. He told what had happened to him, the property on Miller Street, the co-signed document that a family friend had signed without understanding it, the legal costs that accumulated faster than he could address them, the way when the dust settled a property he had lived in for 12 years had become a parking facility for a logistics operation. He told it without decoration. He was not a man who added things for effect. He told it straight and flat, and the straightness and flatness of it had a weight that no amount of oratory would have given it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Phillips objected to the relevance of the testimony. He made his argument cleanly. Judge Weaver listened to it with the same expressionless attention she gave everything, and then she said overruled, with a finality that suggested the argument had not found purchase. There was a break. During the break, Gene stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with Carver and Keller and Pearl. Pearl had her hand on his arm and was not saying anything, which was unusual for Pearl, and Gene understood that she was not saying anything because there was nothing to say that would make the waiting better, and she knew it, and she was simply there. He thought about the notebook. He thought about the line written 15 years ago by a precise woman with a gift for observation. He thinks he keeps things to himself, but actually he tells me everything eventually. It just takes him time to find the words. He thought about all the things he had wanted to tell her in the last 14 months and could not. He thought about the things she had apparently been doing without telling him: the FBI contact, the letter, the preparation, the trust that he would find his way to it. She had told him things the only way she still could, by the things she had left behind. The break ended. They went back in. Phillips made his final argument with all the professional craft at his disposal. He was good. He was genuinely good. The question of the forged signature was positioned as a matter of disputed handwriting analysis, which was not unreasonable since handwriting analysis was a contested science. The counter-narrative held its shape, and then a bailiff entered from a side door and passed a folded note to Keller, who read it, and passed it to Carver, who read it and looked up and asked in the precise and measured voice of a man who was controlling his reaction to something significant for a brief recess. The note was from Kyle Donovan. In the weeks since the clubhouse confrontation, Kyle had been meeting with federal investigators. He had provided over the course of those meetings a record of communications between himself and Holden's company. He had saved them. The texts, the payments, the specific instructions he had received about what to report and when. He had saved them the way young people sometimes save things without knowing why, out of a vague instinct that they might someday need them. What the note contained was this: among the communications Kyle had provided was a message from Holden's company contacts sent the morning of the day. The forged transaction document was dated 3 weeks after Maggie's death. The message read, "Signature complete, file when ready." The forged Gene Calloway signature had been produced and communicated about by Derek Holden's associates on a day they could now place precisely 14 months before this proceeding, at a time when Gene had been sitting in his kitchen in the first terrible weeks of being alone. Judge Weaver read the communication. She read it twice. She set it down and looked at the room over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who has heard a great many stories and has arrived at a clear and unambiguous conclusion about this one. She did not issue a ruling from the bench on the full matter because federal cases did not work that way. But she issued the emergency stay of the foreclosure proceeding, made it permanent pending resolution of the federal case, and she noted for the record in terms that were specific and pointed that the pattern of behavior documented in these proceedings represented a serious federal matter that would receive the court's full and appropriate attention. Holden's composed expression, which had held through the morning with professional steadiness, showed its first fault line when the stay was made permanent. His lead attorney put a hand on his arm and said something quietly, and Holden's expression reassembled itself. But Gene had seen the fault line, and seeing it was enough. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the fall light that had turned warm by afternoon, the way Kentucky fall days sometimes did, Gene stood with Pearl and Carver and Keller and Bishop and Rufus Armstrong and Jax, and he looked at the street below the steps and the ordinary life of the county going about its business, and he felt for the first time in 14 months, in 3 weeks, that the weight was slightly less than it had been. Not gone, it would not be gone for a long time, but less. Bishop came and stood beside him. They watched the street together for a moment without speaking. She planned all of this, Gene said. Maggie, the FBI contact, the letter. She knew she wasn't going to be there for the end of it, and she set it up so it would work anyway. Bishop was quiet. She didn't trust me to fight for myself, Gene said. He meant it with a specific kind of fondness. She knew I'd fight for someone else, but she wasn't sure I'd fight for myself. So she built it so that when I walked through the door of your clubhouse to do something for you, I was also walking into the thing that would save my house. He shook his head. 43 years of marriage, and she was still outmaneuvering me. Sounds like she was very good, Bishop said. She was the best person I ever knew, Gene said. And I have met some good people recently. They stood together on the steps. Danny Stone, Gene said. Bishop turned his head slightly. Carver arranged something with the Monument Company. It's done. The commission is placed and the design work starts next week. I should have asked you first, but I was afraid you'd say no. Bishop was very quiet for a long time. Why, he said at last, not angry, not the question it might have been. The question of a man who genuinely needed to understand. Because you kept faith with him, Gene said. For 3 years, putting the money aside a little at a time, carrying his picture everywhere you went. That kind of faithfulness deserves to arrive where it was going. He paused. And because I know something about wanting to give a person the thing they should have. Bishop looked at the street below the steps. He looked at it for a long time. Thank you, he said. The words came out of him rough and slow, the way words came when they had been held back by something large. Gene nodded. He did not make more of it. The weeks that followed had the quality of things settling after a significant disturbance. The way a house settles after a hard winter, its boards adjusting its frame, finding its resting place again. Gene's house was safe formally and legally, and in the kind of paper way that meant it was done. Holden's company withdrew every claim, not voluntarily, but in the sense that a position withdrawn under legal necessity is withdrawn. The federal case would continue to its own conclusions over the months that followed, and those conclusions would be substantial. 7 federal charges across 4 counties and 23 victims, and Holden's good coat and firm handshake would not be enough to protect him from them. Pearl Monroe organized what she called a neighborhood meeting that turned out to be attended by about 40 people from the community, the Methodists and the farm families, and the people from the old properties along Route 9. And what came out of that meeting is a fund. They called it Maggie's Fund, which had been Pearl's idea, and its purpose was to provide legal representation to elderly and disabled homeowners facing predatory foreclosure in the county. Franklin Carver agreed to administer the legal side. Bishop and the Iron Covenant agreed to contribute to the initial capitalization, and they did so without ceremony or recognition, which was the way they seemed to prefer to do most things. Rufus Armstrong was at the meeting. He had driven over from Miller Street in his truck, one with the hand controls, and he had sat in the back of Pearl's living room through most of it and said very little. But when the discussion of the fund's structure had stalled on a procedural question, he had raised his hand and offered a solution calm and practical, and the room had listened because rooms listen to men who have paid the price he had paid and speak with that particular earned authority. After the meeting, he and Jean stood on Pearl's porch in the cooling evening and talked for a while about other things. About trucks, about the specific character of Kentucky Fall, about what it had been like to come home from overseas and find the county the same and different in equal measure. They talked with the ease of two men who have been through something together and discovered they are more alike than they would have predicted. "I thought about not coming today," Rufus said. "I almost didn't." "I'm glad you did," Jean said. "I keep thinking about what you said at my house, that I wasn't alone." He looked at the field beyond Pearl's fence line. "I've been alone for a while. You get used to a thing, and then you think that's just how things are." "I know," Jean said. "I got used to it too. Didn't mean it was right." Rufus nodded. "I'm going to come back," he said, "to the meetings if that's all right." "I think Pearl would consider it mandatory," Jean said. Rufus made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh and then became one. One Saturday morning in late October, Jean heard the sound of engines in his yard before he saw the trucks. He stepped out onto his porch in the cool morning and looked down to find Jack Stecker's truck pulled in beside his dead Ford, and behind Jax's truck, a trailer with a selection of tools, and behind the trailer, two more of the Iron Covenant's members, one of whom had a part in his hands, and the part was the throne bearing and its clutch housing replacement, stock new. He stood on the porch and watched them set up. Bishop came last in his own truck, and he got out and looked at the dead Ford with the attention of a man assessing a machine that has been given up on prematurely. "She'll run again," Bishop said. "She was a good truck," Jean said, "before." "Still is," Bishop said. "Just needs reminding." They worked through the morning. Jean was not idle. He was a diesel mechanic, and he knew where his hands went, and they went there, and working beside Jax was the specific pleasure of working beside someone who knew what they were doing and did not need to be told and did not need you to explain yourself when you made a decision about a torque setting, because they could see from the way you moved that you knew what you were doing too. They talked the way men talk when they are working in the shorthand of shared technical vocabulary, and the morning went. At noon, Pearl Monroe appeared with food and the information that she had told Bishop the original truck part specification was wrong because she had looked it up, which was not true, but was Pearl's way of establishing herself as having been involved, and Bishop had accepted this contribution without comment, which confirmed Jean's assessment that Bishop was a man of significant adaptability. By 2 in the afternoon, the work was done. Jean climbed up behind the wheel of his truck for the first time in 2 months and 3 weeks. He sat with his hands on the wheel. He looked through the windshield at his field and his fence and the tree line at the back of his property, the same view he had looked at from this seat through 40 years of mornings. "Go on," Jack said from the lot. Jean turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and then it caught, and the sound of it coming to life under him, the specific deep idle of a diesel engine that has been properly rebuilt and set right, went through Gene Calloway from his hands to his boots, and the sound of it was the sound of something working again after too long in silence. And he sat with his hands on the wheel and let it run and felt the vibration of it in the seat and in his back. And after a moment, he put his head down and he let himself cry. He had been holding things for a long time. Since the morning Maggie died and the grief had arrived with its enormous gravity, and he had set about keeping himself functional, because functional was what was required. Since the bank letters and Holden's visits, in the dead truck, in the Route 9, walks on his bad knees in the 3 days with a wallet he could have kept, and the 40 feet across a gravel lot that had felt like the longest walk of his life. He cried for Maggie for the 43 years, and the empty chair, and the notebook with the line about the way he found words eventually, and the letter she had left in the closet box because she trusted him to find it when he needed it. He cried for the house that was still his, for the kitchen table that had held 41 years of breakfast plates and was still there, for the sunflowers along the east fence that came up every summer because she had planted them first and he had kept planting them after. He cried because the engine was running and he had not been alone through any of it, not really, and he had believed he was, and the difference between believing you are alone and knowing you are not was the difference between a stopped engine and a running one. The men around the truck did what men do when someone needs to feel a thing all the way through. They let him. They stood in the afternoon sun and they let him have it, and they did not make it smaller or rush it or try to resolve it into something more comfortable. They were his friends. That was what friends did. After a while, Gene wiped his face with the back of his hand. He put the truck in gear. He drove it slowly around the lot once just to feel it moving, and it moved the way it should, steady and strong, the bearings silent, the clutch engaging clean. He brought it back around and killed the engine and got out. He looked at Bishop. "Thank you," he said. Bishop shook his head. "You knocked on the door," he said. "We just answered." The headstone was placed on Danny Briggs's grave in early November on a Thursday morning when the frost was back and the trees had given up their leaves and the cemetery in Harlan County was very quiet in the way of that season. The stone was plain granite, which Bishop had chosen, and it said Danny Briggs on it in good letters in the years of his life, and below the years, a single line that Bishop had asked to be cut there. He loved the road and the morning and the people who showed up. Jean went with Bishop, just the two of them in Bishop's truck in the early quiet. They stood at the grave in the cold for a while without speaking. Jean turned his wedding ring on his finger. Bishop held his hands at his sides. Then Bishop said, "I've been talking to him all 3 years, telling him about things, what the club was doing, who was new, what roads we'd ridden." He looked at the stone. "I told him about you, about the wallet and the door." He paused. "I told him that not everybody is who the county says they are." He always liked hearing things like that. Jean looked at the stone. He thought about a boy who liked engines and grinned at cameras and was 24 on the day that the wet road and the driver who didn't see him ended everything. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Jean said. "He was the best person I ever knew," Bishop said. They stood there together for a while, two men who each carried someone out in the cold of a Kentucky November, in the company of a stone that now had a name on it instead of a number. On his way home that afternoon, Jean stopped at Maggie's grave. He did not do this often. He was not sure the grave was where she was. He thought she was in the kitchen table, and the sunflowers, and the handwriting in the notebook, and the FBI phone number at the bottom of a letter, and the specific quality of the coffee she had preferred that he still kept buying. But he stopped today. He stood at the stone with her name on it, and her years and the line he had chosen. She took care of people. She did not ask for credit. "You outmaneuvered me again," he said to her. "I want you to know that I noticed." The cemetery was very quiet. "I also want you to know that I am all right. I know you were worried about that." "I am all right, Maggie. The house is ours. I kept the promise. I'm still the man you married." He paused. "Pearl says I'm famous at the Methodist congregation. I thought you would want to know." He turned the ring. He looked at her name in the stone. "I found the right people," he said, "the way you knew I would." He stood there a little while longer. The afternoon light was low and gold and flat and cold, the particular light of November in Kentucky that did not warm you, but was honest about what it was. Then he walked back to his truck, the engine sound solid and steady under him all the way home, and he turned down Route 9 the way he had walked it so many times past the shoulder, where a brown leather wallet had been waiting for him in the gravel one frost-cold morning, past the mailbox at the end of his drive, and he pulled in and looked at the house that was his, the house that had 41 years of his life. In every room, the house where the sunflowers along the east fence were gone now until spring, but would be back, and he sat for a moment with the engine running. Then he went inside, he put the kettle on. He got out 2 cups because he always got out 2 cups, and he made 2 coffees the kind Maggie had preferred. He sat at the kitchen table. He drank both cups slowly in the quiet of the house that did not feel empty anymore, and he told her about his day. Outside in the last of the afternoon light, the field to the east was still and gold, and exactly itself the property that had once been the Meriwether land, and had briefly been the target of a man in a good coat who had made the mistake of believing that a lonely old man was the easiest thing between him and a large sum of money. He had been wrong about the lonely part, and he had been wrong, it turned out, about the old part too. Because an old man who has spent 40 years with his hands on engines knows something about the difference between a machine that is broken and a machine that is merely stopped, and knows better than most that the two things are not the same, and that what looks like an ending sometimes is not an ending at all, but a quiet morning on a gravel road in a flash of brown leather, in a choice that does not look like much from the outside but contains for the person making it the whole of everything. Gene Calloway finished his coffee. He washed both cups. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to sit on the porch in the last of the evening, the same porch where he and Wade Briggs would sit through a good many more sunsets in the years to come, each of them a little less alone than they had been the morning a wallet turned up in the gravel on Route 9, and the frost was hard, and an old man's knees nearly talked him out of bending down. He was glad his knees had failed. He was glad about a great many things. But we are getting ahead of the story because there is a part of the courthouse morning that has not been told yet, the part that happened in the hallway during the break, and it is the part that changes how you understand everything that came before it. Jean was standing near the water fountain with Pearl when Phillips Holden's lead attorney came out of a side door and walked toward him. Not toward Carver, toward Jean specifically. He walked with the measured pace of a man who has made a professional decision and is executing it cleanly. He stopped 2 feet from Jean and said in a quiet and entirely professional voice, "Mr. Calloway, I want you to hear this from me directly. I have been in practice for 23 years. I have represented clients in a great many matters. What I have seen today in that courtroom is the clearest evidentiary picture of systematic and deliberate fraud that I have encountered in those 23 years." He paused. "I am not at liberty to advise my client contrary to his instructions, but I want you to know that I am aware of what this case is, and I am aware of what was done to your wife." Another pause. "I am sorry for your loss." Jean looked at him for a moment. "You didn't have to say that," Jean said. "No," Phillips said. "I didn't." He turned and went back through the side door. Pearl looked at Jean. Jean looked at the door that had closed behind Phillips. "Well?" Pearl said. "Yes," Jean said. He thought about that exchange for a long time afterward. He thought about it the way he thought about the mechanic at the repair shop who had asked him years ago, when a customer had brought in a truck that had been repaired badly by someone else, whether it was worth fixing or whether they should just tell the customer it was done. Jean had told him it was always worth fixing if the bones were right. You could not know from the outside what the bones were like until you got in there. Phillips's bones were right. He had stayed in a system that required him to do his job and had done it, and at the end of the morning, he had walked across a hallway to say a human thing to the person his job had been arrayed against. That took something. Jean thought about that. He thought about how many people in the various rooms of this situation had turned out to have better bones than he had initially assessed. Bishop, Jax, Kyle, even Kyle, who had taken money he shouldn't have taken, and had then sat in meetings with federal investigators for 2 weeks voluntarily providing everything he had because he knew what it was to have made a wrong turn, and he was not willing to go further down that road. Carver, who had driven from Lexington before the ink on the retainer was dry. Keller, who had been running a 2-year investigation and had kept Maggie's trust by waiting for Jean to find the letter on his own. Even Rufus Armstrong, who had the best reason of anyone in that story to have said no and walked back inside his house and closed the door and let the rest of the world manage its own complications. They had all chosen something. Every one of them had come to a point where the easier thing was available and had chosen the harder thing instead. Jean thought about that point. He had stood at it himself on the shoulder of Route 9 with a dead knee and a wallet that could have solved his problems, and again at the kitchen table for 3 days, and again when he opened the truck door and told the neighbor to wait, and again when he knocked on a door he had every reason not to knock on. The choice was always available. The choice was always the same choice, between the thing that was easier and the thing that was right, between the road that was shorter and the road that took you somewhere worth going. He had not always gotten it right. He thought about the days when the bills came and he had snapped at Pearl when she called on Sunday because her voice was there, and Maggie's wasn't, and about the month he had not opened his mail at all, because opening it required a kind of attention he could not locate in himself, and about all the mornings he had set out 2 cups and then sat with the evidence of his own habit and felt the specific humiliation of grieving badly. He had not been a man of extraordinary virtue through this. He had been an ordinary man, trying to do his best and not always succeeding. But he had picked up the wallet. He had sat at the table for 3 days and not opened the slot with the folded paper. He had knocked on the door. And Maggie had known he would. She had known it 14 months before it happened, in a hospital room on a morphine protocol, writing a letter by hand in the hours when Jean was asleep, or gone for necessities, trusting him to come to it in his own time and his own way. She had not been uncertain about it. The letter was not a hope, it was a plan. That was the thing about knowing someone for 43 years. You knew the shape of them. You knew what they would do when the moment came, not because they were incapable of other choices, but because you had watched them make this choice again and again over 4 decades in the small, daily ways that character revealed itself, and you knew at the bottom of everything who they were. She had known who he was. He was the man she had married. The federal case against Derek Holden and Holloway Properties concluded 11 months after the hearing with 7 guilty findings across 4 counties and 23 documented victims. The sentence included significant federal time and financial restitution to the victims, which in Jean's case represented not the value of the pressure campaign or the fraudulent documents, but the legal costs and the damages from what the judge described in her ruling as a deliberate exploitation of a grieving person's vulnerability. The ruling cited Maggie's FBI testimony submitted posthumously as a sworn statement as foundational to the prosecution's case. The county paper ran the story on the front page. The headline was, "Lexington Developer Sentenced in Multi-Count Fraud Case." The photograph was of the courthouse steps. Jean was in the background of it, slightly out of focus in his good coat, looking at something off to the right of the frame. He had not noticed the photographer. Pearl Monroe cut the article out of the, put it in a frame, and tried to give it to Jean, who told her he did not want it framed. "Why not?" Pearl said. "Because it isn't the story," Jean said. "The story is in the kitchen." Pearl looked at him. "The kitchen table," she said, "and the closet boxes, and the wallet, and the 40 feet of gravel." He paused. "The story doesn't need to be framed. It already lives somewhere." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm putting it in my kitchen then." "That's your kitchen," Jean said. "You can put what you want in it." She did. Jean saw it every time he went over for Sunday dinner, which was most Sundays, because Pearl had decided that Jean coming to Sunday dinner was not optional, and Jean had decided that Pearl deciding things was easier to accept than to resist. Bishop came for Sunday dinner twice in the year that followed, on occasions that required Pearl to cook considerably more than usual and to move the table setting, and both times the conversation went from early afternoon to well into the evening. The 5 of them, Jean and Pearl and Bishop and Jax and Rufus Armstrong, who had started coming to Sunday dinner on a basis that was described as occasional and had become more frequent than that. Those evenings had a quality that Jean had not experienced in a long time and found he could not quite name until one Sunday in March when the light was coming long and gold through Pearl's kitchen windows, and someone had said something that made everyone laugh at once, and Jean sat back in his chair and listened to the sound of it. 5 different laughs filling a kitchen, and thought, this is what it is supposed to be. People together. The specific warmth of a table that has been sat at enough times to have a character. He had thought for the 14 months of his grief that he was waiting for something to end, for the grief to run out or the bills to stop or the pressure to lift. He had been thinking of it as a passage, a thing to be gotten through. He understood now that it had not been a passage. It had been a year of becoming. The year in which an ordinary man had been remade into a slightly different ordinary man, one who knocked on doors he was afraid of, and sat with difficult choices until they clarified and understood at 72 years old that the thing about being old was not that you were running out of time for things to matter. The thing about being old was that you finally knew which things mattered. And what mattered was this: a table with people around it, a truck that ran, a ring worn thin on the inside of the band, a notebook with a line about sunflowers in August, a stone in a cemetery with a name instead of a number, a fund in a woman's name that had by the spring helped 9 families keep their homes and had 3 more cases pending. What mattered was a knock on a door that 40 feet of gravel had led to. The knock that everyone said was a death wish and turned out to be the opposite of that. The knock that turned out to be, as these things often are, when you look at them clearly, not an ending and not a beginning, but the sound of a man deciding what he was going to be and deciding correctly. The wallet was in Jean's kitchen drawer now. Not because he had kept anything in it, the cash had gone back with Bishop, and whatever else it had contained had been returned without examination. But Bishop had pressed it into his hands on the courthouse steps and said only, "Keep it, that's yours now." And Jean had looked at the brown leather worn soft from years of Bishop's back pocket and had understood what was being given and had accepted it. He kept it in the kitchen drawer next to Maggie's notebook. On the mornings when the coffee was made and the light was good and the house was quiet with the particular quality it had taken on in the last months, a quietness that was not absence but fullness, Jean occasionally took the notebook and the wallet out of the drawer and set them on the table beside his cup. He did not open either of them. He just looked at them side by side in the kitchen light, the record of a life and the object that had turned its final chapter, and he felt in those mornings the thing he had been looking for since the morning Maggie was gone. Not her presence exactly. not the absence of loss, but the certainty that who he was had been sufficient, that the man she had married had shown up when it mattered, that the promise had been kept and the right people had been found and the wallet had gotten home. That was enough, more than enough. It was in fact everything. Spring came as spring does, without asking permission. The sunflowers went in along the east fence the third week of May, the same week they always went in, because that was when Maggie had always put them in, and Jean had learned from watching her that the timing mattered, and the timing was that week. He had gotten the seeds from the same place she had always gotten them, the hardware stores in town, the same bin, the same packet, with the same sunflower photograph on the front. He had stood in the hardware store holding the packet and thought about the first summer they had owned the house, when Maggie had come home with those seeds and planted them while Jean was still figuring out the garage and the field, had erupted 3 months later into something that surprised him because he had not been paying attention. And then suddenly they were there, tall and certain, and completely themselves against the fence line. He planted them now with the same intention she had brought to everything she did, which was the intention of someone who planned carefully and trusted that what she planted would come up. He was on his knees in the dirt, which his knees did not love, but accepted as necessary when he heard Bishop's truck on the road. He recognized the engine sound now, the way he recognized Pearl's Civic in Jax's truck, in Rufus's hand-control pickup, the specific grammar of their engines, the way engines told you who they belonged to, if you had ears for it. Bishop pulled into the lot and got out. He stood looking at Jean in the dirt with the fence and the bare patch of ground waiting for seeds. Sunflowers, Jean said without looking up. Looks like, Bishop said. She planted them every year, Jean said. I intend to keep that going. Bishop came and crouched beside him in the way big men crouch, with a specific arrangement of the body that managed the geometry. He looked at the ground. I've been thinking about getting something growing at the club, he said. Something that comes back every year. He paused. Danny used to say the lot needed color. Jean looked at him. I'll give you half these seeds, he said. You get twice as many plants that way. More than you need. Bishop looked at the packet in Jean's hand. He looked at the fence line where the bare earth waited. All right, he said. They planted them together, Jean and Bishop, in the Kentucky spring, on their knees in the dirt, pressing seeds into the ground with the intention of people who have decided to take the long view about things. The morning was cool and the light was good, and from the field to the east, a bird was making its argument about the season, and the world was exactly what it was, which was imperfect and sufficient and worth tending. Jean turned his ring on his finger without noticing he was doing it. Some habits were worth keeping.